This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
The terrifying case of the Glamour Girl Slayer. In the late 1950s was a golden era where young and beautiful aspiring girls flocked to Hollywood and searched for their limelight. Few of them were lucky to find their stars. Some didn't make it. And then there were those unfortunate ones who ended up in the hands of merciless people like Harvey Glattman. In this video, we're going to let you get acquainted with Hollywood's most horrifying serial killer, dubbed the Glamour Girl Slayer. A troubled background. Born on December 10th, 1927, in the Bronx, Glattman's parents, Albert and Ophelia, were somehow aware of their child's sadomasochistic sexual tendencies. According to his mother's testimony, a 12-year-old Glattman was once discovered choking himself with a rope for sexual pleasure. "It seems like I always had a piece of rope in my hands when I was a kid," Glattman said in one of his interviews. "I guess I was just kind of fascinated by rope." Growing up in Denver, Colorado, Glattman wasn't exactly a well-liked kid. Children would often make fun of him because of his odd physicality. Being shunned from his peers, this made Glattman very aloof to people, especially girls. An early life of crime. Glattman began committing crimes by breaking into the homes of women in his neighborhood. What was once a petty act of robbery quickly escalated into sexual assaults. When he was 18, he tied up one of his female classmates and at gunpoint molested her. The bespectacled boy continued his run of burglaries coupled with sexual assaults on women for years. He did get arrested each time he was caught, but his parents would bail him out of prison each time. In 1946, Glattman fully embraced the life of crime. He did so by doing a series of attacks on random people, including nurses, a husband and wife, and a young woman. He got caught at some point, and he was sentenced to 5 years prison time. However, his good behavior in prison, as well as his exceptional intellect, enabled him to cut short his jail time. A dangerous photo op. After the death of his father, Glattman moved to Los Angeles, where he supported himself as a TV repairman. During these times, he also posed as a glamour photographer. He would convince women to pose for him in bondage situations in exchange for money. In 1957, a 19-year-old woman named Judith Dull answered to Glattman's casting call. She was apparently desperate to earn some money to pay a lawyer she hired in a child custody battle with her ex-husband. Glattman ordered her to wear a specific kind of clothing, on which the would-be victim obliged. Things got out of hand quickly, when upon arrival Glattman tied her up, saying it was part of the shoot. Well into the session, Glattman pulled a gun and ordered her to strip down. He took more photos before raping her. After the act, Glattman strangled Dull to death, took more photos of her corpse, and abandoned it in the desert. Under fake identities. Barely a year after the Dull incident, Glattman lured a certain Shirley Bridgeford into his trap. Using the alias of George Williams, the man took Bridgeford to dinner before bringing her to Vallecito Mountains. In this remote place, Glattman pulled out his gun and ordered her to undress. He proceeded to rape her. Like what he did to Dull, Glattman murdered Bridgeford after raping her. He then took pictures of Bridgeford's body before disposing of it. 4 months later, Glattman found his third victim, Ruth Mercado. This time, he's using the name of Frank Wilson in the hopes of covering his tracks. Like the two aforementioned ladies, Mercado had fallen victim to Glattman, raped, killed, and her corpse abandoned in the desert. Glatman's killing spree could have gone on, if not for his arrest, which took place a month after Mercado's murder. Glatman was working then as a photographer for a prominent modeling agency in Hollywood. He really intended to kill the owner of the agency, who herself was a model. Disturbed by Glatman's murderous aura, the woman signed up another model, Lorraine Vigil, to take her stead. Vigil, a newcomer, obliged to take the photo op call. Like what he always did, Glatman abducted Vigil, but she was able to fight back and escaped. She told the police and had Glatman arrested. The toolbox. Upon his arrest, Glatman confessed to killing Dull, Bridgeford, and Mercado. He also mentioned about the toolbox, a box containing the photos he took of his victims before, during, and after their murders. The toolbox was found at Glatman's apartment, along with its contents. Authorities opted to use the photos as evidence against the accused during Glatman's court hearing. Glatman later told police where he threw the bodies of the 3 women. Trial and sentencing. During his trial, Glatman's mother apologized for her son's actions. She went on to describe the man as sick. Meanwhile, Glatman's lawyer tried to convince the court of his client's apparent mental illness. The court waived the appeal and concluded that Glatman was fully responsible for his actions. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and was given the death penalty. He was detained at the San Quentin State Prison in San Quentin, California. Glatman was executed in a gas chamber that uses lethal cyanide on September 18, 1959. He was 31 at the time of his death.
Gerard John Schaefer was a sheriff in Florida when he was denounced by 2 victims who had only just escaped from his grasp. He used his badge to gain trust from his prey.
He is absolutely the worst person that I've ever seen.
He looked into my eyes and he said, "You don't understand because you're not a serial killer."
Condemned to life in prison in 1973 for the murder of 2 young women, he is initially considered responsible for the deaths of 32 other victims, before another 100 are cited. Gerard Schaefer was killed by another inmate in 1995.
If he had ever come out of prison and then confronted me or put me in any fear of harm, I was totally prepared to kill him.
A serial killer is defined as an individual who has committed at least 3 murders in a space of a few days to several years. A psychopath characterized by their excessive appetite for murder and the pleasure they extract from their actions. Their crimes make them feel all-powerful, to the point where they feel they'll never be caught. A pathological pervert. An individual with a cold and calculating temperament. Other people are simply objects to be manipulated and dominated in order to achieve their aims.
He is the worst serial killer I ever interviewed.
He could look you right in the eye, and you know he wanted to kill you. And he'd smile. He had a smirk on his face.
He was such a mixture, such a hodgepodge of different types of deviants.
Cruel, inhumane, cold, and calculated as it comes.
During the many hours of interview with Gerard Schaefer, he was always full of smiles, very charming, but I knew I was in front of the darkest of any abyss, in front of Gerard Schaefer. I had literally the impression of a psychological rape on his behalf.
What are you accused of? Well, I was originally accused of killing 34 women, but nobody has ever managed to come up with 34 names, jurisdictions, or anything else. It's a false accusation.
And what is your conviction?
I was convicted of killing 2 in Fort Pierce. I was never shown to be at the crime scene. There was never any link between me and the people that were killed, except the testimony of the mother of one of them.
Stéphane Bourgoin says he felt that it was someone who was evil, because in his eyes you don't exist. The other person doesn't exist. The other person is denied their individuality and their humanity. This is a case of perversion that's rarely seen, thank God.
Gerard Schaefer is condemned to life in prison in 1973 for the murder of 2 young women. The police will later attribute a further 34 victims to him. But they estimate that he may have killed between 80 to 110 people. In 1972, Robert Crowder is already the sheriff of Martin County in Florida.
I met Gerard Schaefer when he was an applicant for a position as a deputy sheriff. At that particular time, he was a police officer in Wilton Manors, Florida, in Broward County. And he was looking for a job as a deputy sheriff in another county. And at the time, he had what's been described as an apple-cheeked, wholesome appearance, could be very pleasant, almost charismatic in the way he would deal with people, but later we began to see that there was a different face underneath that facade.
Schaefer moves into a house a few kilometers away from the sheriff's office. He seems perfect for the position of deputy sheriff. But exactly 28 days later, Schaefer makes a grave error and is unmasked by his superior.
I was home that Saturday morning mowing my lawn. Telephone rings. My wife calls me in. I go to the telephone, and it's Schaefer. And he says, "You are really going to be mad at me. I really did something stupid." And I said, "Well, tell me what's going on." He says, "Well, yesterday when I was working, there were these 2 girls, teenage girls, hitchhiking, and I stopped to talk to them and gave them a ride and tried to impress upon them how dangerous it was for young girls to hitchhike. There were a lot of problems they could get into, trouble, bad things that could happen to them, and they just laughed at it and didn't take me seriously. So I arranged to meet them today, and I was going to put a scare into them and show them, convince them that it's dangerous so that nothing would happen to them later if they would do what I said." And he said he took them into the woods and then told them he was going to sell them into slavery. And then he said to scare them, he left them there to sit for a while, and then he was going to come back and let them loose. When he came back, they were gone. They had managed to get loose from the ropes.
The 2 young girls in question are called Pamela Sue Wells and Nancy Helen Trotter. They know that they only just escaped a perverted killer. After arresting Schaefer, Robert Crowder wants to understand what took place. He orders a reconstruction with the 2 young girls. What he discovers chills him to the bone. Taken to the undergrowth outside of town, Schaefer decides first to gag the 2 young girls before attaching their limbs, putting a rope around their necks and tying them to a tree. And then Schaefer announces that he's leaving, that he has an errand to run, but he'll be back to finish the job. He tells them he's going to kill them, But first, he's going to torture them. But in his absence, the two girls free themselves and run away.
The girls told me basically the same story that Schaefer had told about meeting and then being picked up the next day. And he had also, they said, had pinched them on the buttocks and touched them in other ways. I don't remember exactly how it was all described. But then they began to get frightened when he tied them up and then drove off.
Schaefer is then arrested by his boss. A new fact then comes to light that will unmask him completely. Two bodies are found around Vero Beach, in Fort Pierce to be precise. Robert Stone is the prosecutor at Schaefer's trial, which begins in October 1973.
First, we realized we might have a murderer was when some old man was going through the underbrush looking for tin cans, aluminum cans, and he found a bone that he thought might be human. So the police went there and searched the area and found the remains of two people, two humans. They found the skull and scattered teeth. And almost at the exact same time, a mother of one of the girls who had been missing since September of '72 was going through the county, and she noticed the license plates, so she went to the tax office to find out if the plate number she had, if there was such a person in that county. And in fact, it belonged to Gerard Schaefer, who was in jail.
Schaefer's apartment is searched, and what the police discover there is the final confirmation for them that he is guilty.
He kept souvenirs of all of his victims, and we found a little jewelry box that had souvenirs of several girls that had been missing in Broward County, which is a county south of here, and we knew that he probably killed those people too.
During the search, in addition to jewelry belonging to the victims, the police find photos that the killer took himself before and after the murders. As in the case of Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter, Schaefer uses the same modus operandi when he kidnaps Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. He takes the two young girls by force to the woods near some swamps that border the ocean. He chooses a clearing situated in the middle of the swamps, a few hundred meters away from the road and hidden from view. He binds them and ties them to trees.
He'd make them drink alcohol, try to get them, drunk, photograph them, and he'd love to see them urinate, and because when they're hanging there, that gave him a big charge, and he just wanted to do everything he could to humiliate the women.
The ritual is probably linked to the pleasure taken in domination. Moreover, the attack is usually done with a knife because then there's physical contact with the victims. So either with a knife or strangulation or even suffocation. So the victims are touched. And of course, he makes them suffer slowly. And the slowness is part of the ritual.
And then after he killed them, he would, have sex with them as long as they were able before they started decaying. And then he would mutilate them, and he would masturbate over their bones.
Welcome to another summer episode of True Crime XS. As the summer is winding down, we're focusing in on an interesting killer that you've probably heard of before.
So where we ended up, we were talking about matches, and you had heard a statement by a defense attorney that sort of like sent you down a path, and you texted me and you were like, if we could figure out how to get this beyond speculation, and you've made it clear that you were speculating, but this would be a huge deal the boy in the box has been a mystery for 60-some years now. And a lot of people have put in a lot of time, and there are these theories like that come up about who he could be. So this is like pure speculation about two dead people. But what I found interesting was we don't have a connection to part of this yet, except for like you hearing an offhanded phrase, which is interesting to me because you hear it, and I think you at least saw one example of this. It was almost like that phrase had been misinterpreted over time.
I really can't wrap my head around any of that just yet. I still can't. Like, even having heard it and continued to research it, I don't get it.
Okay.
Like, I don't get everybody's missing it.
Yeah, and we run into a few things like that, and we're like, why do we hear it? But, like, I sort of found, okay, so the boy in the box only came to be the boy in the box because there was another case that had happened simultaneously that sort of provoked the guy who had found the boy in the box to report it.
Right. And
His name is
actually,
Frank.
when I started, so it's actually a really good sort of testament to the point we were talking about with missing children is if you look back in history on February 25th, 1957, or I guess that would be the 26th, but there's two simultaneous stories running on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And one is about a found little boy, and one is about a missing little girl. And it's kind of crazy. Like, the irony is not lost to anyone, I'm sure, but to see, you've got this one child who was dumped and one child they can't find. And it seems like it's almost impossible that this child could go, all these years and not be reported missing, just looking at what happened with the little girl who went missing at the same time, right around the same time he was found.
Number 1, Mary Jane Barker. At only 4 years old, Mary Jane Barker from Belmar, New Jersey, went missing on February 25, 1957. The young girl was last seen playing with a 4-month-old spaniel puppy at about 10:30 a.m. that day. She was on her way to meet her neighbor and friend, 6-year-old Maria Frietta, who also happened to be the owner of the puppy. A while later, when her parents started looking for her, Mary Jane was nowhere to be found. She was reported missing to the police by 1:30 p.m., and immediately, many people feared that she might have been kidnapped. Police started searching the area close to her home, and near the stream out back, they identified a set of footprints belonging to what looked to be a dog, a young child, and an adult male. They measured the child's footprints and said it was the same shoe size as Mary Jane's. Because she was so young, her disappearance sparked a huge response, with almost 200 volunteers showing up on the first night to begin looking. Everyone there searched the area, and by the third day, there were over 1,000 volunteers looking for the girl, hoping they would find some sort of clue as to her whereabouts. On February 27th, her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Barker, appeared on television pleading to the possible kidnapper to return their daughter to the nearest church. Police interviewed Vern Lovering, a 43-year-old man who was a convicted child molester in the area, and he admitted to being near the Barker home when Mary Jane went missing, but he said he had nothing to do with the kidnapping. By February 28th, 3 days after she went missing, the FBI then got involved. They too interviewed Lovering and conducted their investigation after police received a phone call demanding a $500 ransom for the child. This prompted cops to appeal to the supposed kidnapper not to act in haste or harm the child. The disappearance was especially hard on the family since it was Mary Jane's birthday on the 28th and her father's on March 1st. The family was planning to celebrate their birthdays together. However, on March 3rd, the Barkers' lives changed forever. On that day, her friend Maria, together with her mother, went to check the newly built ranch house next door owned by Maria's aunt. Maria opened a bedroom closet door, and out came her puppy, leaping towards her. Also found inside the closet was the dead body of Mary Jane Barker. She was slumped down in a sitting position on the floor and was wearing the same clothes she had on from the day she went missing. Curiously, the house was searched 3 times, but no one had thought to check the bedroom closet. However, the police chief said he believes the body was placed in the closet instead of being kept there, since the puppy seemed to have been fed recently. What's more, if the dog was indeed trapped inside with the little girl for several days, there was no sign of animal waste in the closet, despite the fact the puppy wasn't housebroken. Even more compelling is that during those 3 initial searches, no one had heard a dog barking at all. The door wasn't locked, but from the inside there was no knob that the little girl could use to open it up. Mary Jane's body was autopsied the next day, and there were no signs of foul play found, neither were there signs of molestation. When they opened her stomach to examine the contents, all it had inside was chocolate milk, the last thing she drank before she disappeared on the morning of February 25th. To find out why the dog was alive and Mary Jane dead, the dog was put down as well so its stomach contents could be studied. Eventually, her death was ruled as an accident and that she had died from starvation and exposure. Because of what had happened, then Mayor Cornelius Devenel ordered all closet doors to have a knob from the inside as well. Mary Jane's disappearance and the media surrounding it also helped lead to the first calls reporting the discovery of a murdered young boy in Philadelphia. Frank Guthrum, the person who had discovered the boy, had found the body the same day Mary Jane disappeared, but hesitated to report it. He eventually did, though, and it led to the discovery and investigation of what is now well known as the boy in the box, a story we have previously covered.
Right, and she had not been found yet. So this is Mary Jane Barker. This is the case of Mary Jane Barker, and she's up in Belmar, New Jersey.
Great, and so that's close to, well, I guess it's over.
Yeah, it's across
Delaware.
the river, but it's across the Delaware River. But her case was one of those cases that basically she disappeared with, I think it was her neighbor's dog.
Yes, she had her neighbor and playmate. The little girl was 4, or she was her 4th birthday was in just a couple days, and her little playmate was 6, and she was playing with the dog out in the yard, her playmate's dog.
Right, and so this little girl and the dog just vanished, and the police are notified. This is at like 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. The police are like involved by like 1:30 that day.
Huge deal. I mean,
Yeah.
huge deal. And they immediately assume she's been kidnapped because of various...
Right. The way that she vanishes, she's presumed to be not only a kidnapping, but a stranger abduction. So
Right.
they find footprints, and then the footprints at first seem to be hers, and then they find footprints of what looked like a man, a child, and a dog. And
Right, which fueled the theory, right.
So the disappearance touches off this, massive search. And like you said, the Philadelphia Inquirer is covering it in the headlines, which is sort of unusual to have a missing child in the headlines that quickly.
Well, I think that it's not unusual. I think that what's unusual is for something like this to happen. I think that that's where it's interesting, because I think that any child that this happened to would be in the news just like that. It's just it doesn't happen that much.
So the FBI gets involved really quickly with this case. The boy in the box is essentially, because of all the flurry of activity, his discovery is reported by the person who found him first.
Right, because that man had been out and he had seen the box, and he assumed what was in the box was a doll. He didn't... And this man, he wasn't a person of interest or suspected of anything. He had gone out, I believe, checking for traps or something.
Yeah,
and
he was avoiding getting caught he didn't want to be called out on possibly having illegal traps.
Well, he didn't know that it was a kid until when he heard that the little girl was missing. He immediately reassessed whether or not, because it was so far out of his realm of thinking for it to be like a dead child in that box, that it had to have been a doll. And so when he found out the little was missing close by, he then called the police and said, when I was out, I came upon a box, and in the box was what I thought was a doll. But it may have been that little girl.
Right. And these two cases are like, there's a dichotomy here of like how different they are from the perspective that like we still don't know who that boy is, but everybody knew who this girl was. And this is sort of like if you see a scene in the movie where the cops come in and they tap the phones and they interview the usual suspects and they're waiting on a ransom and like all of those things, they did all of that in this case with Mary Jane Barker. There was a ransom demand that turned out to be unrelated. But the reason it was unrelated isn't that somebody else did it or whatever. It's that over the course of several days, from the time they find the boy in the box and the little girl is missing, and that's around February 26th, February 27th, that's in the papers. By the time they do all of that, this little girl is found. And it turns out there are some conspiracy theories around this, but it turns out that like it was a pretty innocent thing that happened, and it seems accidental. She basically went into a new vacant home.
That was next door to where she was playing with the dog.
Right. And she gets, trapped. And even though the home had been searched, people didn't look inside the closets. And the closets at the time had a mechanism that didn't really, it wasn't like the doorknobs we have today. And
right. And so the closet shut and she couldn't get out, essentially, is what I understood to have happened. And she starved to death on her 4th birthday. Yeah,
she starves to death. And there's no, they even go as far as this is terrible. It's one of those things in cases I read, and like they euthanize the dog to try and figure out.
They wanted to know why he lived longer than she did.
Right, and he was just a puppy. Puppies are pretty resilient. He was like a couple months old, so. Now,
and my experience is, it's weird. It is, I do not feel like there was a conspiracy involved here. I think it was just unfortunate, but it is really strange that this 4-month-old puppy, like, he didn't make any noise. Like, it's weird. Because, like you said, not only did they search the house, but there were people, like, installing a bathtub. Right. There's all kinds of stuff that occurred. But the little girl ultimately, she died of starvation. There were no signs of foul play. She was wearing her clothes that she left in. And essentially, it's like I would assume she may have even followed the puppy. I don't know how she ended up there, but it seemed like it was on her own accord. In the cases of foul play, bad guys don't take pretty little girls to go, not touch them and put them in closets and lock them in. That's not usually what happens. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense that somebody, and because she was found so close to where she went missing, who's going to bring her back? Like it wouldn't make sense otherwise. But I do find it extraordinarily odd that in the days that she was missing, because she was found, I believe, the following Sunday, however many days that was.
It was several days.
She couldn't make enough noise. Now, they did say that there were signs of her, trying to escape. It was something about the mechanism on the back of the door that basically it just meant her little hands couldn't figure out how to get it. It wasn't like a normal doorknob.
Right. So in order to open those types of doors, so they had a knob on one side, or a latch, depending on the closet. But on the other side, it was basically just like a turn, like a single turn. And if you're not tall enough and can't put enough leverage on it, you wouldn't be able to open the door. And she's small. She's a little girl. She's, 3 and change, turning 4, right?
Yeah, she died on her 4th birthday.
Yeah, so she wasn't able to do that. And the
thing I wonder there is, so I have to wonder, and this isn't really to be a conspiracy, but it makes me wonder, maybe they didn't really check that house as well as they claimed to have or whatever, because to me that makes more sense than have going in, checking, and not heard anything. Puppies are not quiet, and neither are the girls who are all freaked out. I mean...
Well, that's where the conspiracy sort of comes in from what I read. People talked about there was no waste in there. Although a dog that's not eating or drinking, it's not going to do a lot. They said he came out and he was pretty energetic. So, I mean, I got hung up on the fact that the little girl that owned the dog was actually the playmate, the 6-year-old. And she ends up getting a new dog from a radio station. But I was sort of like, okay, this puppy survives this ordeal.
And then they kill it.
And then you guys kill it.
I was so irritated because it didn't tell them anything. No offense, but whose stupid idea was that?
Well, the thing I
think that they were trying to somehow, and another, so a side note to that is not only was the puppy the victim, the little girl who wandered off, not only was it her puppy, but that little girl is who found her friend.
Yeah, and that's
she opened the door and out came the puppy and the little girl was in there.
Seated. Just kind of waiting for somebody to come get her.
Yeah, isn't that terrible?
It is, and I had even thought, I wouldn't have jumped to let's kill the puppy. My thought would have been maybe she was playing an extended game of hide and seek in that house, and that's where she was last or something. I mean, no matter what you say about it, she somehow ended up in there. The dog ended up in there, and the searchers missed them. Search and rescue just missed them.
And when I say maybe they didn't check the house that well, I'm not trying to cast blame. I'm just trying to explain. It seems more logical to me that in that type of situation, you would say, oh, yes, she didn't go in there, as opposed to having thoroughly searched the house and missed her. That seems just really odd to me, especially when the first chance the 6-year-old playmate neighbor dog owner has the opportunity, she finds her.
Right. And that was striking to me, is that the playmate found her. Well, I guess my biggest thing was could it be, I went down this one rabbit hole, and I find these things, there's not a lot on the internet about this case. I mean, you can read old articles and stuff about it, but there's not a lot of video or podcasts or whatever, because it's a tragic accident. It's not really that interesting. But I did see one person go down the rabbit hole of, well, what if a killer had put her in there to come back and get her, but the search had stopped them? And, I was like, that's not going to be a thing. She's too close to the scene. You would just go ahead and take that child that small with you if you're doing something like that. And
why on earth would you leave the puppy with her?
Yeah, that's the other thing. I couldn't really wrap my head around what they were saying.
I don't believe for a second that I feel like that's
accident.
A stretch. Yeah, that's all. It's a weird accident.
That's a sharp contrast to Boy in the Box, who has been...
Okay, and so that perfectly illustrated sort of my point about this little girl goes missing, and really what has happened is she and her neighbor's dog have gone. Now, oh, by the way, the neighbor playmate, her aunt and uncle owned that house. They hadn't moved in yet, but they were building. Okay, so that's why they were in there when they found her, was because they had gone to check on something for the aunt and uncle. So it would be her mom or dad's brother or sister.
Okay, so you've got all these people looking for this one little girl, and then this other kid can't even get reported missing.
Okay, and so it's my opinion, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that there's any characteristic more besides just the fact that she was a little girl. It could have been the boy in the box. It could have been any missing child. And that community would have freaked out just the same, no matter who was, child-wise. So how is it? You've got an entire spectrum here from, not even being reported missing to they've immediately deemed it a kidnapping and, the whole world's involved. How does that happen?
I don't know. So that is what leads us down the rabbit hole we're down right now. So
thanks for that.
With the boy in the box, there has been a lot of speculation of who he is and what happened to him. There is even a society of retired investigators who've gotten actively involved in talking about the boy in the box. And I'm going to place a piece of audio in here related to the boy in the box. And this search has gone on for over 60 years at this point. So 1957, today, we're at, almost 64 years. So they've gone and they've hunted down what they think happened and who they think was involved and hit a lot of roadblocks.
It seems to me like they've hit, not roadblocks, dead ends. I mean,
right. They haven't.
When they find the child that, it supposedly is over and over again, that's the dead end, I think. Yeah.
When authorities arrived on February 25th, 1957, they found that the naked body was that of a boy between the ages of 4 and 6 years old, but small for his age and displaying signs of severe malnourishment. His hair had been hastily, closely cropped into a sort of bowl-style cut, possibly just before or after death, as there had been clumps of hair still clinging to his body. The body was covered with bruises as if he had been severely beaten, but yet had been carefully, almost lovingly arranged in the box with his arms gently folded over his chest. Further examination of the body turned up some interesting clues. His fingernails had been carefully trimmed, and his hands and feet showed evidence that the body had been submerged in water for a long period of time, either just before or after the death, perhaps because he had been bathed. An examination of his eyes found that he had possibly suffered from chronic eye ailment of some sort. On the boy's ankle and groin had been scars and indications of having undergone surgery, and he had another scar under his chin. Medical examination would find that he had eaten approximately 2 to 3 hours before he died, and in his esophagus was found a dark brown, unidentified residue, thought to have been perhaps vomit. The cause of death was determined to be possibly from multiple severe blows to the head, but this is not certain, and the body was estimated to have been out in the woods anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks. It was difficult to determine an exact time due to the weather having been extremely cold. The crime scene itself held clues as well. The box was from the department store JCPenney and had been meant to hold a bassinet. The investigators found it promising that the box still had the manufacturer's serial number visible upon it, meaning that they could find out the exact shipment that it had come from. Additionally, there was even the address of JCPenney's that it had been bought at, which had been located only about 15 miles away. Not too far away from where the box had been dumped, there also was found a cap with a distinguished leather strap and buckle. The boy's fingerprints had been taken, pictures were heavily circulated, and authorities thought that they would quickly get to the bottom of the crime, but they would be proven wrong. The box turned out to be one of 12 bassinets sold to the store, but records in the purchasers had not been kept as they had paid in cash. 8 of the buyers would eventually come forward after reading about the case in the news, and all of them had either thrown away their boxes or kept them to store things in at their home. The other 4 buyers had remained unknown. A cab that had been found had also led to a dead end, even though it had been traced to a store run by Hannah Robbins, and despite the fact that she had distinctly remembered a man who had bought it, the payment had been made in cash and none of his information had been taken. Authorities had painstakingly gone door to door to every shop in town with pictures of the boy and the cap, but no one could recall even having seen either. The boy himself would prove to be the most frustrating and mysterious of all. His fingerprints were ran through hospital records and extensive databases, but did not come back with a single result. It was also found that no one had any record of a missing child fitting the description of what the media was calling the boy in the box. And despite hundreds of thousands of flyers and notices sent out nationwide, as well as countless law enforcement bulletins, including the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin, no one had come forward who knew about the boy. No family, no friends, no doctors, no one. Orphanages all over the country were also approached, but none of them had any information or knowledge about the boy as well. The American Medical Association passed out details on the boy's surgical scars in the hopes that a doctor somewhere may know him, but no one would come forward. Frustrated, authorities even went as far as to widely circulate photos of the boy fully dressed and in a sitting position to make him look more lifelike, but there was still nothing. Authorities did everything humanly possible to track down any hint of who the boy could be, and came up empty-handed every time. Some possible leads trickled in, but none of them led anywhere, and with the total anonymity of the boy, and with the lack of any records whatsoever, it was as if he never existed at all. It was totally baffling, as surely someone must have known him, and there must have been a worried parent or playmate out there who would have seen all of the media attention, but there was nothing at all. The boy was a complete cipher, as was whoever had killed him. It wasn't even known exactly how he died. The only person questioned on the crime was Frederick Benosis, the second person who had discovered the box, but he was soon cleared and released. With nothing to go on and the case unsolved, the mysterious boy was buried in Potter's Field on January 24th, 1957, with money gathered together by various detectives on the puzzling case. The boy's simple gravestone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy. February 25th, 1957. Although the case was officially closed cold, there were some detectives and investigators who refused to let it go, becoming somewhat obsessed even, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Every possible clue had been pored over, and there were even psychics brought in to work on it, but it was futile, with no new answers forming out of the clouds of questions orbiting the case. Some possible leads did sporadically come about. One initially promising lead was a foster home just 1.5 miles from where the body was discovered, which was pointed out by a psychic that had been brought in out of desperation by medical examiner Remington Bristow, who had become one of the most tireless investigators on the case. At this foster home was discovered a bassinet of some type that could have been from the discovered JCPenney box that the boy had been found in, along with several blankets that were reminiscent of the one that the dead boy had been found wrapped in. Bristow suspected that the boy was living there and had been killed by someone in the home, possibly even the owner, Arthur Nicoletti, either intentionally or accidentally, but there was no concrete evidence to show that the home had even had the boy in the first place, and certainly nothing solid to link them to the crime. On November 3rd in 1998, the boy's body was eventually controversially exhumed in order to extract DNA in hopes that modern technology could shed some light on the case. But this also led nowhere, and the body was reinterred in November 11th, 1988, at the Ivy Hill Cemetery in Cedar Brook, Philadelphia, on a donated plot, and with the headstone reading America's Unknown Child. Another theory came forward in 2002 when a woman from Cincinnati, Ohio, only known as M, claimed that she had known what had happened to the mysterious boy. In a disturbing testimony, M claims that in 1954, her mother had purchased the boy from his parents for cash, after which he had been subject to horrific physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. According to M, her abusive mother would frequently beat him and had accidentally killed the boy, who they had named Jonathan. All of this would occur in a fit of rage by smashing his head into the floor after he had thrown up in the bathtub. Since the story seemed to fit so well with the evidence and details at hand, but became suspicious when it came light that the woman making the claims had had a history of mental problems, considering that there was also no hard evidence corroborating the story either, along with denials from the woman's neighbor that such a thing had even happened. The lead was eventually dropped. However, over the years since, there have been occasional new leads that have turned up from time to time, but so far, none of them had led to any new answers upon this mysterious and most baffling case.
We had the question of, like, who the kid was, but also were his parents involved in how he ended up in that, bassinet, JCPenney bassinet box.
Right. But, okay, so if you'll recall, when we were talking before about missing children, when parents do not report a child missing, they are more than likely involved in why the child is missing. Whether it be foul play or an accident or covering for someone else or whatever, it's very strange. We were talking about with Mary Jane, she was reported missing within minutes of when she wasn't where she was supposed to be, which is what I feel like is pretty normal for a 3-year-old child. And actually nowadays, a 3-year-old wouldn't be playing in their neighbor's yard without somebody watching them. Times were different then. And to have this little boy who not only was he not reported missing before his body was found, a very talented, experienced many groups of people have been unable to identify him. And so to think about what it takes to make that happen, it almost goes from like uncaring parents to like they had to like try really hard for him to never be identified. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, that makes it. There's such a huge disconnect in those variables of him never being identified and no one remembering him that it's almost impossible that it's happened at all.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It is. It's one of those things where like the parents not only had to have been either involved or completely out of the picture, but if they were involved, they have to be particularly devious and complicit to the child's demise, which something in there should have shook out an answer.
Right, and I agree with that.
So where you and I ended with that was you had heard this phrase, and I'm just going to go ahead and say this phrase has been misinterpreted to say a particular well-known serial killer says to his lawyer that his first victim was a man. That's how it's written up in two different locations. One of them, you found this extremely extensive timeline, although confusing at times, where this guy, this timeline you found is someone trying to put together multiple sources to make some sense of what you and I realized was not really a closed case. And it just so happens that his origin was dubious. And that put us down the path of, okay, let's look at him and see if we can tie him to the area, the child, or possibly like tie the child to him, which is seemingly impossible because we don't know, much about the kid. And you...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you and I have talked about a different first victim for this killer in the past, and it was a little girl that we couldn't quite wrap our head around what had happened to her. But this would be ahead of that. So this would be a very small, if I remember the math correctly, this would be 10-and-a-half-year-old boy killing a under 6-year-old boy. Right?
Correct. Well, depending on how old the boy in the box is, but yeah.
But we took it
essentially
a step further because of the parent situation we've been talking about. And
actually, what I began with was this is important as far as like my train of thinking goes. The very first thing I did was I found a physical link that had evidence that at least parts of his life, the killer had lived under 10 miles away from where the boy in the box was found.
Right.
And so that's really important because I don't know, like without that, because, 10 miles is still a long way for a almost 11-year-old or 10-and-a-half-year-old to get without assistance. But that is one heck of a coincidence. So it immediately says either the killer did it, and this was his very first experience with it, or, it was his parents. That's what because how could it possibly be? If it wasn't that killer that did it, it has to be somebody he knew.
Right.
No
and
question.
We sort of removed the ward of the state option because we felt like wards of the states would subtract. And that means if he was in foster care or like under the care of a different legal guardian than his parents.
It seems more likely in those situations that, there's more people to report the kid missing.
And that was what made it even more interesting that he possibly fell through the cracks. But we did consider something really interesting, and that was whether we were right about the killer, who is of dubious origin, and this child might have slipped under the cracks because he's possibly related to the killer. And we looked at a number of aspects. We speculated on a number of possibilities.
I've tried really hard to find something to substantiate it. In situations where children are, this is in the 50s, and when children are born to unwed mothers in the 50s, a lot of times they go to like wayward girl homes. Is that what, I mean, something to
unwed
that
mothers.
effect?
Yeah.
Okay. So they have their baby. A lot of times the baby's put up for adoption. And those types of records by nature are sealed. Like you can't find those types of birth records even now, because once a child is adopted, they get a new birth certificate with their adopted parents on it. And basically they are legally their parents, and the original birth certificates are always, they remain sealed forever, I believe. I think you could possibly get them unsealed, but I don't think so, because it's a legal transaction that occurs. Once adopted, a child becomes the adopted parent's child. So we're talking about a situation where, okay, and you can go along or put your theory up against mine or whatever, but I feel like it was another situation where mom has a baby under terrible circumstances for whatever reason. There was then mention of what the parentage would be, but it could possibly be a half-sibling of the killer. It could be a cousin of the killer, meaning that it would be one of his mother's sisters having had the child, but all of them ending up living under sort of the killer's grandparents' home, like under their roof to some extent. And so basically I'm seeing another like hidden child sort of situation, just like the killer himself is in. Not hidden, but he wasn't, his origins weren't exactly presented to him in a very clear manner.
No, they were
until
dubious.
until he was much older. And so another situation where, there's a child that exists and the family's not proud of the situation, and there's little known of the child is what I'm thinking. And I think that in the event that this was the killer's half sibling or cousin and he killed him, that I feel like the family might have covered up for him.
And I agree with you. And I took it a step further because of the killer situation. So what had happened there was he was born in an unwed mother's home and put up for adoption. We know that. Now, circumstances didn't pan out that way for him. He was reclaimed. But he spent his first 2 months in an unwed mother's home. Mom was there for the child, goes back to her life, and then ends up reclaiming the child, and he is raised in peculiar circumstances. I took it a step further and I said, one of the reasons that you might have to hide that completely is if the child were product of incest. And that's been speculated on, but it's not been proven. That would be a genetic thing that would have to be tested for. And I could say that it might not even look like incest genetically, and here's how that would work for me. I think it could potentially be the killer's full sibling if the same two people that had him had this other child. And that would basically mean that the person that we know as the grandfather, who may not have fathered other siblings of mom, had a child with who is mom, turned out to be the killer. If that happened twice, that's a double reason, one, for the kid to end up without having real birth records, two, for family members to cover it up. And that gets complicated because in this situation, I feel like that would have been uncovered at this point. So you sent me a photo
with that, you're wanting to test for the relation to the killer, correct?
I want to test to see if there is a relation between them, yes.
Okay.
And I think that's important, like one of the first steps in this. I don't know how we do, if the killer killed this, boy in the box, I don't know how we do that particular investigation yet. I'm going to figure it out because there are people who,
I think that whole squad would jump right on it if we could give them enough information.
We need to give them one
I think the grandparents living less than 10 miles away from where the boy in the box was found, along with the off-kilter statement. Okay.
Right.
I think that is enough to warrant somebody that knows what they're doing to take a look at it. I mean, that's too much for you to just say, oh, that's nothing.
Well, I think so. So who we're talking about here, I'll let you say.
We're talking about Ted Bundy.
So we think Ted Bundy may have killed the boy in the box in Philadelphia in 1957, or
right.
sometime. We would have to see specifics of like the death timeline.
I did find in the paper there was information of him having been molested. That was one thing I wasn't sure of before, because the attorney alludes to like them having some sort of sex game in the woods, and he killed. And the attorney says he was very young, 12, 13, 14, which to me was just as easy as saying 11, in my opinion. Right. And so, that's why I was looking for victims, because now that we've said it's Ted Bundy was this monster in my existence, and he was put to death when I was way before I was ever interested in any sort of true crime stuff. But he was always like this fictional like character, serial killer character. And because of that, I guess in my mind I thought, well, they know everything there possibly is to know about that guy, because why wouldn't they at this point? And he did come into Keyes's interview from, of course, Ted Bundy's trial was the first televised trial on a major network, so that gained him infamy. And that is just a whole nother story. But I was so taken aback when the attorney, now it's interesting because, help me remember, his name is John Brown. Okay. John Brown was not, that I'm aware of, he never actually defended Bundy. And so this is something that I feel like needs clarification, because the show is in defense of. But he was more of his legal advisor. And the reason for that was that John Brown practiced out of Washington. And ultimately, after 2 escapes from prison, Bundy was put on trial in Florida. Well, first he was in Utah, then Colorado, and then Florida. And basically, John Brown didn't have a license to practice in any of the states. But he goes on the show, and he served sort of as Bundy's sort of legal advisor, even though he wasn't representing him. He did mention that he had signed, Ted Bundy gave him a waiver of attorney-client privilege before he died.
Right.
So he was able to talk about it without completely destroying his reputation. But even with the waiver, I guess there's limitations. And he does seem remiss and a little reluctant to, he didn't get probably as many details as would have been given to him if he had acted interested in it, as far as when he was discussing it with Bundy, because Bundy, he was having a very dramatic day. The day that John Brown is talking about him telling him this. And it seems to me like John Brown attorney, he's a very respected attorney. He's done a lot of good things. And a little bit, I said when we were talking about this, I said, it's come to my attention that perhaps everything's not completely on the up and up. And I don't think that's like purposely. I think it's just when things are told, sometimes it's not telling the entire truth. Like you'd have to make your own assessment of it. But in the show, in defense of, he makes some statements about the work he did for Bundy that I don't find to be historically accurate in other accounts of it. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved. It just means that it's not really documented that he was involved. For example, when they were trying to negotiate the plea deal for him to not be put to death, like John Brown takes credit for that in the episode I watched. But in reality, it was a different attorney that's on the record as doing that. Does that make sense?
I'm on the same page with you that like some of it's dubious.
So I try to like follow and figure it out. Now, I don't think he would have like gone on and talked about stuff that was completely untrue. I'm just saying that the accounts can differ depending on the source. And I don't think there's any question that he knew Bundy, and he did do some sort of legal advising for him at some point in time. You know, he very well could have made that confession. Now, is it that everybody like already thinks that about John Brown, and that's why this little nugget of information doesn't blow everybody's mind?
It could be. I mean, so my understanding...
Well, what did you think?
Well, the Florida stuff was contrary to his historical accuracy. But historical accuracy has been presented by people, and, you know, this comes up a little later on in how we do this. Like, because once we get into this part of Bundy, there are several things I want to cover, which I've sort of gone over with you. But one of them is the people around Bundy who were supposed to be on the good guy side did some incredibly questionable things. So I have no doubt that the defense also has that same possibility with them. And I say that because Bundy became sort of a case for the ages, and everybody who was very close to having interviewed him or very close to him or had participated in the investigation put out their own version of events. And
they're all the hero in it. I mean,
it created this mythos of the super cop that is sort of, so I started this podcast, the very first episode, I talked about how I have problems with the Snallygaster legends, which particularly I have problems with, you know, the boogeyman legends surrounding people who took children. And that you know, that puts Israel Keyes and Ted Bundy in the same category. And I don't think that Keyes was all that into Bundy, but I think that was who in his mind he could reach for very easily and knew a lot about because there was so much material about Bundy.
That's what I think. I think it was just the availability, like, because like I said, well, and not that Keyes would have had a television to watch the trial on, but that's who was
in the books, and that's who
right.
was on the papers. And I think that just like the Snallygaster, that there is this, you know, Lone Ranger legend that sort of happens with police. And that may not apply so much to this episode, but I am going to say that also bears, as true crime enthusiasts, as good investigators, as good researchers, whatever you want to call it, you have to look at some of the stuff they say with a huge grain of salt, because some of them are not being accurate. And that's not even, I'm not even talking about John Brown, because I feel like John Brown was discounted. But what I've discovered is you don't know. Once you read those accounts and the media accounts, you don't know the whole thing. There's still a lot that happens behind the scenes. And I do believe that the references I found say that Brown was accurate in that episode particularly, at least up through Colorado. Because when Bundy got caught in Colorado, that was one of the calls that he made, was to John Brown.
Right.
And that
yeah,
before and after the escape. So that's real.
Right. And so, you know, like I said, so having never looked, I've never looked into Bundy, like on any level except the fact that he is a very well-established historical serial killer who, he wasn't even killing during my lifetime, but he was put to death in my lifetime. So it has never crossed my mind. He's just something that exists I've never thought about. And, you know, I do find things that randomly come on about him interesting, but I've never like taken the investigative approach to it. And when I heard what I heard, I was just so surprised, because I've never heard anybody say anything like that before. And I thought, why? Because, you know, to me, he killed a bunch of girls, basically. A bunch of college girls is what comes to mind. And then I think I knew that his last victim was really young. And, of course, from Keyes, I know, I can't ever remember what they are, but I know he had different rules about what he would and wouldn't talk about. And when I heard the attorney say, that he had killed more than 100 people and that his first victim was a young boy, I thought, that's just crazy. And even so, what I was reading most recently, it's kind of an ongoing product, and I think it was most recently updated 2018. And the accounts I'm reading there are not reflective of a serial killer that was killing somebody when they were 10, 11 years old. I mean, so it puts it in a light that I can't quite wrap my head around it, because I don't know why everybody's still, I know why it hasn't gotten more attention, and why, books or discussions I'm seeing are about the timid 20-something-year-old that still hadn't worked up the nerve to do what he wanted to do in his 20s, Got John Brown saying he killed a little boy when he was a little boy. And to me, that's just really strange that perhaps they have discounted it because John Brown is the only person he told, and they can't take it for what it's worth, or they have taken it for what it's worth, and it's not worth anything. I can't find information about anybody having explored this to any extent. Now, there was the little girl in Washington who was thought to be his first victim, Ann Burr. And so she comes up, and you actually mentioned her.
There was a woman who came up with a book, and I quoted her. I actually had an interview of her in one of the early episodes when I was trying to confirm what would Key's first victim look like. I just sort of, but I used Rebecca Morris.
He spoke about his potential for having killed Ann Burr. And
right.
In that scenario, I believe he would have been 14. And so that is speculated on as far as could he have done it? Would he have done it? Every single sort of assertion has a downside to it that somebody has, said no, because whatever. And so I can only imagine what this would bring. But I would say, and I don't know how this works because I don't know about the legality of it. I do think that the fact that, a serial killer put to death by the electric chair and a little boy discarded, having not been reported missing by his family, I don't know. I would want to be respectful of the child's rights. However, give up some stuff sometimes when you leave your kid in a box in a lot, a vacant lot. And I think if we could establish he was related to Bundy, it would be pretty much a given that he was killed by Bundy.
Or if we can establish what Bundy's back and forth with his grandparents was really like, that would also assist.
I know that he was in Pennsylvania a lot. That's what I've sort of gleaned from. I don't know that at this point we could even get a firm schedule or a firm itinerary of when he went back and forth, but I do know that he was back there quite a bit. And unfortunately, fortunately in some respects and unfortunately in others, so much time has passed. I've never heard that Bundy's grandparents lived less than 10 miles away from where the boy in the box was found. Have you ever heard that?
No, I didn't know it until you and I started looking. I thought it was a further distance.
Right. I looked it up on a map, and it's as the crow flies. It's not it would be further if you were driving it or whatever. So, but, for a straight line, that's pretty daggone close, in my opinion. And then, of course, what the speculation here would be is that Ted Bundy accidentally killed whomever this is, and he would have needed help if not disposing of the body, help concealing the fact that the child had died. And just sort of inherently the only way that could have been done is if it was a family member.
Correct.
A lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but historically, it has been demonstrated that parents, when faced with the fact that one of their children has killed another one of their children, they will just sort of instinctually protect the remaining child. I don't know what I think about that. I don't really think anything of it, but I feel like this is like wildly speculative, but like it makes so much sense because
it does.
Of the bizarreness of the boy in the box to begin with, and then of course when I saw Mary Jane's disappearance sort of chronicled beside of the discovery of the boy in the box, it's so just mind-blowing that sweet little boy who was mistreated and discarded like he was nothing. And, you've got this little girl who the whole world is looking for practically. It just really shows you sort of like the injustices that happen in life sometimes. So from what I've read about the boy in the box, they have investigated every lead. They've looked and looked and looked and looked. They had people saying, oh, it's this guy. And so they would, track down whatever leads they were given, and they would ultimately find every child that he was reported to be. And most of them were alive and well. And so they just really couldn't get their, and I'm talking about the investigators, like it was mind-blowing to them even while it was happening. Probably with no clue it was going to go on and on forever.
I think people may wonder, like, who they is in regards to the boy in the box and other investigations. And we do have to present something related to the Vidocq Society and sort of tell who they are and what they're doing, because that ties back into the super cop thing. Because there are, like, they do everything kind of, it's kind of secret in a way, not super secret, but it's not. They publicize what they need to publicize in order to get a case solved, and I think they're important from the perspective of who they is, and particularly in this case.
Michael Capuzzo, let's talk about this group of investigators, the Vidocq Society. Who's in it? What are the rules?
Well, the Vidocq Society was founded by Richard Walter, the forensic psychologist and profiler, and his friends Bill Fleischer, who's the commissioner and who's the leader of the society. He's a former FBI agent and a sort of tough-nosed Philadelphia private eye. And Frank Bender, who's the world's most famous, if not most gifted, forensic artist. And the three of them were having lunch in 1990 and bemoaning the rise of murder rates all across the country. And they had the idea that they wanted to get together over lunch. Actually, it started socially and evolved into a club of great detectives and great forensic specialists from around the world who meet once a month, the third Thursday of every month, in an old Victorian dining room in Philadelphia, men and women, and solve murders over lunch, or begin to examine them over lunch. And then when passion grows and relationships are formed between great detectives like Richard and say, a Kansas Bureau of Investigations agent who needs help on a cold murder case he can't get his hands around. Well, then Richard, for instance, in the Texas case, went out and spent 6 years and 6,000 hours pro bono putting a killer in jail. So they're a crime-fighting pro bono organization of real characters, and they like to be around.
Now, are there rules about who gets to present a case to the Vidocq Society?
The rules in general are that the Vidocq Society makes every effort to stay in the background and be an assistant to law enforcement. So they will not engage or consider any cold case unless it's at least 2 years old. And they will not consider a cold case unless it's an innocent victim. In other words, it's a drug dealer who's been murdered, and even if his mother's upset, is not going to get an audience before the Vidocq Society. And after that, it's whoever they think they can help and whoever they think they're interested in helping.
All right. And it's not a case where they're butting into local law enforcement typically, right? You will have local law enforcement will come and actually make a presentation over lunch. Is that the way it works?
Yes, like in the case you brought up, the Falls Township or Police Department made a presentation there were friendships between former Philadelphia police officers and some there at the Falls Township. And they come to lunch, and they have a PowerPoint presentation, and it's a white, round tables and white tablecloths, and the lunch is served. And then in about the fourth or fifth course, up comes the corpse on the PowerPoint, and the lights go down. And there's a real exchange. The detective, cold case detective from the police department, or the federal or local or state, will stand at a podium and run through the case, and then ask for questions and help. And there's a close relationship and interchange.
And give us a sense. Now we know that the former FBI agent William Fleischer is involved. Richard Walter, who's with us in this interview, is there, and then the sketch artist Frank Bender. What are some of the other criminal investigative skills that are represented in the society?
It's a tremendous range. I think of it as CSI to the 10th power, but real. I mean, they have other profilers in addition to Richard, like Robert Ressler, the great former FBI agent, Interpol, and the director of Sûreté, a captain from the Egyptian army, experts in white-collar crime and terrorism and sadism, and even a psychic, pathologists, and, the bread and butter stuff of criminal investigation.
Richard Walter, I wanted to talk a little bit about the kinds of killers that you have seen over the years. What kind of killer covers the eyes of his victims?
Anger retaliatory.
Meaning what?
Meaning that they're out of anger, out of an intense anger, they're reacting to a perceived real or manufactured slight that they believe that the victim created against them. Therefore, then they aggress and they destroy. They don't care when the victim dies. They care when they're satisfied. They do not feel guilty. They cover the eyes because they don't want the victim, even in death, to be looking at them as they walk out the door. They try to eclipse that from them. And they feel good after the murder. They historically have a sense of well-being for about 45 minutes to an hour and a half. And then they have different plots past that point in terms of the investigation.
You've written there are three other types of killers: the power reassurance killer, the power assertive killer, the anger excitation killer. We won't go over them all. But one of the things that struck me was that you wrote in this book that you have to be careful what you say and write because sadists are the first ones who will attend your lectures and order reprints of your papers. How do you know that?
True. Because they do. In fact, I think Mike even included in the book a story that I told him that years ago I was in Kansas City, or Topeka rather, at a conference. And I had been at the police department and was taken back then to go up and give a lecture on sadism. And the detective who had been with me earlier in the day and showed me a suspect in a murder case, came up to me just before I went up on the platform, and he said, you know that guy? He said, I pointed out to you at the police department. And I said, yes. And he said, I just flushed him out of your audience. And I said, oh, okay. And I've had other places where if I'm lecturing, for instance, on rape or whatever else, that rapist will sneak into the audience. It's not just myself, but Bob Ressler has had the same thing.
He's the FBI profiler, right?
Right.
But tell me, what is it you think that they're there for? What is it that might they learn that troubles you?
If I then show them the learning curve for sadism, and they understand its direction and its power, then they can try to manipulate that and make it more complex. And I think it's complex enough, and I don't want to interfere in the investigation any further. And I think it furthers their pathology, actually. And so good people are supposed to be stopping them, and we don't want to make them more efficient at knowing how we're going to do it.
You said
Richard doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael Capuzzo.
Richard doesn't want to become, if I might, their Dr. Frankenstein. I mean, I was fascinated by the whole notion that there's this downward growth, like we think of an upward growth toward God or whatever, goodness, whatever we perceive as a personality growth, and this inexorable downward growth that Richard has identified, sort of right to hell. And he doesn't want, I think, I would interpret it as for him to become their interpreter, their coach, their doctor.
Right.
Richard Walter, you've spent most of your life doing this. You're not married, right?
Not anymore.
What kind of person does it take to do what you do well?
I wouldn't encourage anybody who I loved to follow in my footsteps.
Why?
There's a price to pay. I'm willing to pay it. I would much rather encourage people to develop healthy families, relationships, enjoy the beach. And yes, can I do all that too? Yes. But I think that I've come out reasonably well. But if you haven't figured it out by now, there are those of my friends who might even say I'm a little eccentric.
Eccentricity doesn't seem such a terrible price. What is the price you think you pay for doing this well?
Loss of innocence. You say, if I do my job well, there's going to be somebody in the society who maybe I can protect that doesn't have to learn all the evils that there are, that they can go ahead and they can live their life and they can go to the theater and they can go to the art and they can live the quality of life that I think that all of us would like. But sometimes along the way, there are those people, and I'm probably one of them, who then see that life just doesn't always happen that way. And so therefore, sometimes somebody has to make the investment into how do we protect people that is the most efficient. And so sometimes we pay the price.
Well, Richard Walter, Michael Capuzzo, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Richard Walter is a forensic psychologist and a founding member of the Vidocq Society. Writer Michael Capuzzo's book about the society is called The Murder Room. You can read an excerpt at our website, freshair.npr.org. I'm Dave Davies, and this is Fresh Air.
You had mentioned doing sort of like ancestral DNA matches to figure out who some of these unidentified bodies are. I think this would be like the perfect situation to do that in. Now, of course, if he was an only child and his lineage didn't continue on, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to track it, because in order for that to work, it's got to be somewhere, right?
Well, yeah. It's complicated to do familial DNA in a situation like this.
But this case, it lends itself to sort of it deserves some wild speculation, if you will. Just because it's done the run of the mill of what typically would have occurred and led to this. And, they haven't gotten anywhere. And wow, how frustrating is that?
And that's where I sit with cases like this. And in my head, it's 25 years, but it's definitely 50 years. Once you hit the 50-year mark, if a case is still open, you can do whatever you want, legally, to try and close it. Because, at that point, most of the time, your defendants are not in a position to where they're going to have to defend themselves against your wild. We have seen some recent examples where that is pushing it, but 50 years, certainly 63 years, is the time that speculation can come into play, and you can try and close some of these cases for the sake of history. There are so many people around Bundy that have told stories, and Bundy told his own stories as well. Essentially him killing co-eds. That's how you envision it. That's the memories I have of my first encounters understanding the Ted Bundy story. Were sneaking into a room and watching from behind this couch where my mom was watching a movie based on Stranger Beside Me, the Rule book, which was starring Mark Harmon. That's my image of Ted Bundy in my head. Him killing these college girls, and they're all pretty young actresses. And, you know, you can see the pictures of the victims. They are all very pretty.
Welcome back. Ted Bundy is believed to be one of America's most prolific serial killers. Before he was executed in 1989, he confessed to more than 30 murders. Police suspected he was behind many more, but they could never prove it, perhaps until now. Hidden in a Florida county clerk's office, investigators found 2 vials of Ted Bundy's blood taken in 1978. And in the age of DNA evidence, that's a potential treasure trove. Lab technicians weren't sure they could get anything from the material more than 30 years old.
Yeah.
Now the FBI has Bundy's DNA on file, giving hope that they can dust off cold cases and finally get to the truth. Few people know the life and crimes of Ted Bundy like author Stephen Michaud. He spent hours interviewing Bundy on death row, face to face, and co-authored The Only Living Witness, the true story of serial sex killer Ted Bundy. He joins me now from Dallas. You know, when I heard about this blood and the potential for matching or checking the DNA with this cold case from, 1961, I thought, gosh, why was that not done before? How come? What's the answer to that?
Well, the technology really wasn't there at the time that Bundy was being tried. DNA was very, very new then, and it hadn't passed any of its court tests. It was just being introduced at about the time that he was executed. But at trial, they really had to rely on what is today considered basically pretty old-fashioned, primitive, what is called serological evidence.
What do you think the likelihood here is of an answer one way or the other, I guess, on this case?
Well, it all will depend on what kind of sample tissue the various police departments have. They're going to go into their evidence lockers. They're going to dig out the stuff from these cases that now are at least 30 years old and see if there's any DNA that can be recovered from blood or from semen or from whatever else they may have. They now, however, have a full profile. So if they've got a decent sample, they should be able to match it with Ted if, in fact, Ted was the killer.
And this isn't just any old cold case, right? I mean, there's a logical reason to connect Bundy to this, 50-year-old crime now, right? Like, besides the potential of DNA.
Well, the case that really brought this out was the murder of an 8-year-old child in Tacoma, Washington, which was Ted's hometown. Ted was 14 at the time that this child was abducted and never found again. And when he was later a suspect and then a convicted killer, everybody went back to this original case and said, my God, could Bundy have been active ever since he was 14? The police in Tacoma, the cold case squad, really went to work and tried to find some DNA from Ted, and they lucked out with these 2 vials of blood that somebody had stuck away in a drawer down in Florida in 1978. Unfortunately, that's sort of the way how these sorts of things happen. It's pretty haphazard.
People think the actual number of killings that he may have done might be like, more than 100. Do you buy that? Do you think it could be that many?
No. Ted, there's this story that's been around forever about Ted telling the cops in Florida that to add a digit to their guesses, and so he would have killed 130 or 300 and whatever it is. I just don't buy it. I don't doubt that there are murders that he committed that he has not been connected with, and I think that if cold case squads go back and look at what they've got, there's a good chance, if they've got evidence, that they can connect Bundy with these cases. There are several in California. There's at least, of course, one in the state of Washington. And I think there's a very good chance. And even if Ted is not connected, disconnecting him from a crime in a way can be, if not as gratifying, at least as useful to a detective who's trying to figure out who murdered this girl.
And to the families, Stephen.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Good talking to you, Paul.
There are 10 million DNA samples in the FBI's national database, making it the largest database in the world. The database has come up in another serial murder case that just wrapped up in the U.S. Anthony Sowell was convicted 2 weeks ago of killing 11 women. A DNA sample was taken from Sowell back in the 1990s when he was serving a 15-year sentence for attempted rape. But that sample, it turns out, got lost in the mail and never made it to the national database. The prosecutor in this case said that if Sowell's DNA had been in the database, he could have been caught a lot sooner.
Right, sure.
Okay, so here's just like where I'm going with that. What I didn't realize was it wasn't until around 2012, and I could be wrong by a year or so either, that they started adding Bundy to the national database for DNA matches for CODIS. So I thought that was bizarre. I'll say that like right away. And I think that the problem with Bundy and all these stories that have been told by the people around him and the superhero cops and all that, not that there's anything wrong with the Lone Rangers of the world. They just aren't these people. I think that the problem is that something you pointed out previously. Sometimes you get tunnel vision and you don't close the other cases.
Okay, so having not ever looked into Bundy, having heard, his first victim was a little child when he was a young child. I have now looked into a lot of stuff about Bundy, and I feel like the ball was substantially dropped in his case. I mean, he did receive 2 death sentences. And, actually it's surprising that because he had to go through 2 trials in order to receive 2 death sentences. And that's surprising because the resources and the way that the, early 80s work, it was thought to be once he had his first death sentence, and those were for the sorority girls that he murdered. They were like, I retry him. Well, his second trial was for Kimberly Leach, who was a middle school student who was his last victim. They thought, so the premise was it was worth the money involved because it would be harder for him to slip through 2 death sentences, if one was to be overturned for some reason. So pretty smart, but it was once he was executed, and so this is that line that I guess all investigators have to walk. What do you keep devoting resources to? And it makes me really mad that he was basically only convicted of killing 3 people, essentially. He was convicted of the 2 sorority girls. They never took him back to Colorado for the murder case that he was there when he escaped, right? No.
Right.
And then he was also convicted initially. So he was convicted initially of kidnapping of Carol DeRange. Okay. So he was convicted of that. She, of course, lived and was able to identify him. Then he was extradited for the murder of the first murder he was charged with. Ted Bundy did escape from prison twice. One time he was only gone for about 6 or 7 days. The next time he was gone, longer. He escaped on right before New Year's, and he was taken into custody after he committed his final murders in Florida in February.
That sort of is what brought. Go ahead. Do you have more to say about that? Because I want to comment.
Well, I was just going to. The ball was just really dropped because he was not convicted of any of the girls that he confessed to in Seattle, and they're known to be his victims, but they didn't get justice. This is actually one of those situations I've told you before, it's too bad Ted Bundy was killed. Yeah. Because it seems to me like he could have stood for a whole lot more punishment. And it would have been interesting to hear what he had to say. Now, people in the powers that were at that point in time, he was granted several stays, but eventually, they put him to death. He was a monster. He got what he deserved according to the jury. But And I do feel like he was trying to prolong his life, and which is really funny to me because the way he was trying to prolong his life was by confessing to his crime of murdering people. Like, that's just really weird to me.
Yeah, it was a bizarre situation. And essentially, the last hours that he had, he sort of refused to continue to cooperate, thinking he would get a stay. And the people involved did not request that stay. They felt like it was time to put it into the shenanigans. And I think they made a mistake there.
Well, I do too, like, to the extent that we could have learned more from him. But at the same time, I do understand the balance of power, because you can't let a person like that have control over things. I mean, because essentially he would have done it forever and ever. It never would have been enough. Yeah, we're not going to listen to the rest of your confession. You're going to die. Because I feel like my intrigue would not have allowed me to do that. I would have needed to know. I would have wanted to know more. I would have wanted to charge him with every single person's death that he's responsible for the victim's sake and for their family's sake.
This is Channel 7's Eyewitness News with Ernie Anastas and Kaiti Tong, Corey McFerrin with sports, Storm Field with weather, and the Eyewitness News team.
Good evening, I'm Bill Butel with Roz Abrams. Ernie Anastas is on assignment and Kaiti Tong is off tonight. One of the more bizarre chapters in recent American criminal history has come to an end. The end for Ted Bundy, a 42-year-old killer who left a trail of at least 20 murders from one end of the country to the other, came in the electric chair of Florida State Prison. An execution ordered after state and federal appeals were exhausted. An execution that set off cheering from those who had called for Bundy's death. Bundy, with his head shaven and his feet bare, was escorted to the chair by 2 guards. He appeared to be composed and at times even smiled. Just hours before, he told James Dobson, a radio show host, he felt great remorse and his crime should be a warning of the dangers of pornography.
I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has, and I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure. Each time I'd harm someone, each time I'd kill someone, there'd be an enormous amount, especially at first, enormous amount of horror, guilt, remorse afterwards.
An eyewitness later described Bundy's last moments of life.
He made eye contact. I guess it was the way he carried and acted himself. He made eye contact with people in the front row. He spoke to them. He was cognizant of what was going on about him. He made reference to his loved ones and to his family when he was saying his last words.
The hearse carrying Bundy moved from the prison past a group of cheering spectators who had waited for Bundy to die, and some said Bundy should have suffered more than he did.
Ted Bundy is dead.
Ted Bundy was executed for the murder of a 12-year-old girl in Florida back in 1978. Over the past few days before his death, he confessed to the brutal murders of 20 women in 4 states.
What the heck is wrong with that guy? Now, the weird thing is that sort of in researching Bundy, I found that, he's not the only person that was doing these, terrible co-ed murders in the Northwest. And so my mind is, I'm not going to get into everybody, but I was so confused because I never realized how many really sick guys were operating, basically taking young girls during the 70s.
I knew that when you started texting me, and that was one of my points, because we had talked about, are we going to introduce some of the other matches that we do, or are we going to keep going with this? And we decided already that we were going to keep going with this, but I was trying to make a point about how different the 50s versus the 70s versus even the 90s versus today are in terms of law enforcement capabilities. And the interesting thing is the killers that would be the most interesting now have to be really good. And if you look at the 70s, there were a lot of them. And I'm actually dropping an audio from several that were sort of operating and sharing links to them, because there's a few that I don't think people know about. And I've mentioned a couple of them to you. But it is a terrible
I don't know, like, what the, okay, so, and that explains a lot to me personally, but, like, I don't know, like, what the outcome of those I haven't looked into all of it enough to really know, but, like, why do I know who Ted Bundy is as opposed to, not knowing who these people were? Like, it's weird to me because I thought at first I'd be able to, there was a point in Bundy's life where I feel like he switched gears, and those are the victims we know about, right?
Right.
The pretty young girls are not young. I mean, they were young adults, but some of them were not adults. But I think there's like a whole nother slew of victims out there that we don't know about. And, that went along with some of the rules that he had for what he would or wouldn't talk about. And I thought, well, you can pretty much look and see and figure out, oh, yeah, these are definitely Ted Bundy's victims. But that's not necessarily the case because you've got several other unknown serial killers that were, their MOs were very similar.
Right. So when we got to this point, and I'm going to call this the fork in the road because this is it's going to wrap up part of this episode. But so we hit the fork in the road, and that was one of the things we think is we think there's a possibility that the reason that John Henry Brown was consulting Ted was a situation that Ted may have orchestrated himself. So there was one possibility there to go down. And we had looked at, and now I think you've seen there are multiple survived victims of Ted Bundy in the timeline there that this gentleman has put together.
But it also makes me wonder, like, what if they were confused and it wasn't really him? Like, I don't know.
Well, I agree with that sentiment. And I think that that's the reason it's a fork in the road. And the question is, can we solve any of it? In the course of that, and in the course of like trying to encapsulate telling new pieces of Ted Bundy's story, there was a case that like people had speculated he might have been a part of that happened proximally in time to Carol Naranj, who is the girl who escaped. And now we have another Utah case. And you and I went down this path, and that's going to be the next episode. That's not today. But that case to me was interesting because there was one factor that everybody used to rule Bundy out. And it was this bizarre thing that happened, and I'll get into it in more detail later. But I sort of threw it at you, and essentially it was a note left at a scene is what it was. And the note that came was under weird circumstances. And I said, well, I think that other people decided that rules Bundy out. You looked at it, and I don't know that you and I had exchanged thoughts on it. You just looked at it and said, that note is weird. And the next thing I know, you go diving into these FBI files, and you pop back up and tell me about a note. And I was like, there's no way. Because I had read that before, but it had never had any real reason. So like I didn't know, like, why am I, what do I attribute that to? So that was something that occurred in, I believe, 1977 when he wrote that note, maybe.
It was when it was the first time he escaped from prison. And so what had happened was he was in Aspen, and he had not thought it all the way through. This was the time he jumped out the window.
Right.
And he ended up in a cabin in the mountains of Aspen, and he broke in to get food and to find something to wear, and he wrote a note. And the note was to the effect of, oh, silly me, I, broke the window. I'll be back to fix it. So the reason he was at the courthouse that day was because he was preparing for his, the murder charges against him. Now, he hadn't been convicted of murder yet. So basically it's a it's someone who's been convicted of attempted kidnapping and now is facing a murder charge, has escaped. And so everybody's looking for him. And he thought if he wrote this note and so the point was to make the cops think that like some person that was supposed to be at the house had accidentally broken the window, as opposed to the guy that jumped out of the courthouse window to escape custody had somehow been there.
Right. And so this is go ahead.
It was just funny. Ultimately, they did find the note and they did see that what had happened, but that would have never crossed my mind to have noted it in my brain had I not just taken a look and, like you said, the discount of the note in this other case. I thought, well, he did do it before.
And that's all for now. What could we possibly be talking about that is so similar to this other case between Ted Bundy and this note? Find out next time. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LabrottieCreations.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time. This is True Crime XS.
So there were several things that link him to this other thing. And we're looking at it, and, like Mike said, it's crazy the amount of killers that were operating in the 70s that had similar MOs. But, like, the note had a particular aspect to it. So there's that. And here's the scary part. If it wasn't him, then there's somebody operating like him. They got away with it, and it's completely unknown. And we've been debating, like, is it hair? Is it a trio? Like, is it multiple killers? And whatever happened then? And it wasn't just this other case. We found a bunch of them. Because we looked at it and we were like, okay, if we can just find one more that's unusual. And we had specific things we were looking for. But then we found another one. And another one. And we didn't know how to link them all together. And we're not totally sure that we have, but there may be genetically a way to do it.
What was characteristic with Schaeffer was his accumulation of paraphilia. And what does paraphilia mean? Well, they're what we used to call sexual perversions. They're unusual erotic motivations that are not at all shared by everyone. In Schaeffer's case, it was his excessive and very erotic taste for pleasure he took in his sadism against his victims. He was sadistic towards them by practicing bondage, the bands and straps that were found in his drawings and his actual crimes and at the scene of his crimes. But also he eroticized everything to do with fecal matter, that's coprophilia, everything to do with urine and urinary emissions, that's urophilia. He made his victims drink to watch them urinate, and he would photograph them, which is highly characteristic. He would, of course, get sexual pleasure from this, and especially there's this sadism, which is also an extreme and very dangerous form of paraphilia. And while Schaeffer was accruing all this, he had a protective social facade which made him a very dangerous individual.
During his trial, Schaeffer avoids the death penalty, which is suspended at the time in Florida. He is condemned to life in prison. Later, when he is still behind bars, he is officially connected to 32 other murders committed in the area, based on proof found in his home.
This is the house where Gerard John Schaefer lived when I met him in 1964.
Sandra London knew Gerard Schaefer well. She dates him for a year, then loses contact with him and gets back in touch with him 10 years later when she finds out about his crimes.
He always had two stories. Basically, the one was, I am the greatest killer of women in this century. The other side was, I'm innocent, I never killed anyone, and I'm a framed cop. And it was a wonderfully memorable moment. He leaned forward and spoke very slowly as he looked into my eyes. And he said, you don't understand because you're not a serial killer. When he was convicted of the two murders, Robert Stone connected him to 34 dead or missing girls that they weren't able to bring a case on. In dialoguing with Schaefer about that figure, he suggested, or he didn't suggest, he stated in a letter in writing that that his own number would be closer to somewhere between 80 and 110. And he said, he went on about this at length. I mean, it's disgusting. But he was saying, how do you count a murder? If you have a victim gagged and they choke on their vomit, is that a murder? If you kill a woman who's pregnant, is that 2 murders or 1? So he raised that penumbra issue on the actual count of actual murders.
Locked up in his cell, Gerard Schaefer takes his sins to an extreme and publishes short stories entitled Killer Fiction, in which he portrays his own crimes, using a novel as his alibi. The police also use these stories to connect him to other unsolved murders. In the 1960s, Schaefer lives with his parents in the seaside town of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He is from a very devout Catholic family. As a child, Schaefer begins to hate his father, who starts to cheat on his wife, while he maintains an intimate relationship with his mother.
He was allowed access to his mother's bedroom to sleep right in the bed with his mother up until age 16.
Sandra London also remembers an episode that at the time didn't particularly traumatize her. She was 16 years old.
We find ourselves sitting out on the beach at night, huddled in the blanket we usually use to lie down on. Instead, we had it around our shoulders this time. And he totally broke down, and he told me that he had overwhelming desires to kill women.
In hindsight, Sandra London remembers years later episodes that punctuate their youth and that will enable her to make Schaefer talk. When Stéphane Bourgoin meets him in November 1991, Gerard Schaefer has been in prison for 18 years. He never officially confessed to his crimes, sometimes revealing an anecdote about the disappearance of some young women. He was content to play cat-and-mouse games with the law, who tried to make him admit his guilt. Stéphane tries a roundabout way to get him to talk.
While I was interrogating Gerard Schaefer, he was pretending to be innocent, so I decided to adopt a new strategy. Since he was on Florida death row, he was meeting other serial killers like Ted Bundy, the most famous American serial killer. I was selecting specific crimes of Ted Bundy, which were exactly similar to those of Gerard Schaefer. And you can see now how he's in a kind of way, admitting his crimes.
Was he reliving all the time his murders?
Well, I wouldn't say all the time, but I took the... he told me that he had followed my case in the detective magazines, and that he had killed 2 girls in Washington as a copycat crime, so to speak, on the place in Jessup. And I think those were Ott and Naisland. And he would tell me that he took them up on the logging road and strangled them and had sex with their corpses and went back and had sex with their corpses and cut off their heads. Like, it's a tribute. And I'm thinking, you motherfuckers that wrote that. I said, here's the guy who read it, believed your bullshit, and went out and did something like this. And now he's like bragging to me. It wasn't exactly a brag. It was like a tribute. How many did you get, really, Jerry? They said 34. Did they get all of them? Or do you have private graveyards? I said, Dad, I'm the best. What can I say to somebody like that, right? What can you say? You're left without any kind of rational response, because if you say, Ted, it's all bullshit, he's going to say, no, it's not. I know. And he knew, see, because he had lived it. And I hadn't lived it, except through what was written about me. And he was doing it based on what he had read. So he had 36. He wanted to be the best. And he was obsessed because they said I had 34. And he was afraid that I had ones that he didn't know about. See? And he was always trying to get me to say, no, that's all I got, 34, you know. But I never would say that. I discerned that he was concerned about the number. And it was my own way of needling him back by saying, I'm the best, Ted. You're going to fry, and I'm going to be here. And I'll be the best, just like they said. The number 1. Mr. Stone had it all right. The best there ever was. And you're nothing. And he'd just go crazy. It can't be. And I'd take out my little thing from the Palm Beach Post. I said, read that, man. Cult. First page. Palm Beach Post. Cult. I'm the leader of the cult. There you go. Can't be. He was a sickie.
There are certain elements of perversion that are demonstrated and connected to the pleasure he takes at certain times in telling his story true. But at the same time, he wants to be better than the best. The perversion resides in the fact that on the one hand he won't confess to his crimes, and at the same time he lets you know that others aren't as good as he is, that he's better than others. And if you look closely, you can't think that at the point where he licks his lips, when he runs his tongue on his lips, he doesn't extract great pleasure from it, since at the same time there's a particular intensity in his eyes and in the lowering of his voice, which shows the pleasure he still takes in a certain way in reliving these experiences.
As with all serial killers, Gerard Schaefer set his heart on prey that was systematically weaker than him. Young women who are easier to catch.
According to the studies that have been done on serial killers, they're not courageous, contrary to what literature or movies would like us to believe, where they're either shown as courageous or extremely intelligent. Neither one is true. Serial killers are people who attack victims that are weaker than themselves. Generally, they attack women or young men. They're armed, and the victim is going to have a lot of trouble defending themselves. They don't attack someone who is stronger than they are. I'd like to point out that they aren't warriors. They're people who are often afraid of others and are actually considered to be nice people in their everyday life, probably because conflict is not necessarily something they find easy. They're people who are going to avoid conflicts with people who have a certain power.
On December 3rd, 1995, Schaefer is killed by another inmate who stabs him 40 times. A fantasy, an imagined event fulfilling a profound desire.
Even with the Vidocq Society and the FBI, we know nothing about these killers. That's one of the scariest things about them, is we think we do. We put a lot of stuff on paper, and we read a lot of, academic takes on it. The truth is we don't know anything about them. And they're only going to get worse if we don't try and solve these cases. And, this material starts getting incredibly dark and deep and disturbing. But what you're really doing is, like, when you drill down on these killers and you start figuring out who they are, they don't want you to know. That's what they didn't tell investigators. What they didn't tell investigators was shit that embarrassed them. And that's, when you start hearing about people who masturbate over bones and go back and I don't think it really clicks for people how disturbed Ted Bundy was in the terms of what he went back and did to the bodies. And if you miss that aspect of it, you may gloss over it because it upsets your sensibilities. You may gloss over it, but not really discount it as much. But if you don't fully look at it, you miss it. But that's the truth. That's what you're looking for. That's a killer saying, this is the way that I am, and there's nothing I can do about it. But that's also what they wouldn't tell you in words. Keyes didn't do it. Bundy didn't do it. The things that they were embarrassed about are the things that they hid. And that's what you have to go find if you really want to close these cases. Find them saying, this is the way that I am.
Sticks and stones may break my bones. Sticks and stones may break my bones. I don't think you know a thing about what I'm gonna say. I ain't no basic, so don't look at me that way. I don't fit inside a box, and I got a little different taste. Where I hear it's going off, now that's my kind of place. I'm feeling myself tonight like you wouldn't believe. I get up off my feet, I'm dancing to a different beat. This is the way I am, it's just the way I am. And I wanna dance with you, yeah, I'm your biggest fan. Got a spark to you, but if they don't understand, tell them that you're coming through, say it's just the way I am. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but shade can never hurt me. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but love will not desert me. Checking out my horoscope before I walk out the door. Gonna make it beautiful, no matter what's in store. Got a lot of shit to shoot and dollars to be made. Whatever you wanna do, I'm free on Saturday. You're feeling yourself tonight like we wouldn't believe. So get up off your feet, we're dancing to a different. This is the way I am, it's just the way I am. And I wanna dance with you, yeah, I'm your biggest fan. Got a lot of attitude, but if they don't understand, tell them that you're coming through, say it's just the way I am. You think you know me? Yeah, you think you know me? Read the sign of my heart, real bitches only. Ain't got no time for your bullshit. I shoot for stars cause I'm worth it. I bring the heat cause I wanna. You start the beat, then I'm gonna. Ain't got no time to explain myself to anyone else, I'm me. Six inches the way I am, but she can never hurt me. 6 inches the way I am, but love will not desert me. 6 inches the way I am, but she can never hurt me. 6 inches the way I am, but love will not desert me. 6 and stones may break my bones, but she can never hurt me. 6 and stones can break my bones, but love will not desert me. 6 and stones may break my bones, but shade can never hurt me. 6 and stones may break my bones.